Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I'm Ramjee Chandran and this is Season 3, Episode 117. In the last two episodes, 115 and 116, which were released together, we watched Bahadur Khan make his last stand in the Bangalore fort, and we watched the fort fall on the night of 21st of March 1791. The breach was taken, the ramparts were swept, and over 1,400 of Tipu's soldiers and civilians lay dead by the time the night was done. It was a battle of scale, but there's always little record of the scale of the human tragedy of war. History, when it moves quickly, tends to move straight to what happened next. The march, the next battle, the next treaty. It's impatient with the morning after the battle. So in this episode, I stay in the Bangalore fort in the Pete, and I think about the weeks and days that followed the storm of the fort. What happened in the aftermath? What was found? What was felt? What was decided? Well, everything that came after it. But first, as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their generous corporate support, and they make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Let's consider for a moment the story of two mothers. The first lives in Bangalore. She's the mother of a young man, a sepoy, a soldier of Mysore, maybe a craftsman pressed into the garrison service who fought inside the fort on the night of 21st of March 1791. She would have sat at home and heard the battle. The roar of British cannon had been a constant presence for 17 days. But the night of the 21st was different. The noise was of a different order entirely, not of a siege, but a storm. And by the morning, the guns had gone silent. She walks into the Pete at dawn filled with dread. She's looking for her son. Soon, her worst nightmare will be confirmed. The second mother lives in a village in Scotland, maybe in a market town anywhere in Britain. Her son is a soldier of the 72nd or the 76th Regiment. She didn't know yet that he was in Bangalore. She does not know yet there was a battle. On the day of the battle, she was doing whatever she would normally do on an ordinary morning in March, tending a fire, drawing water. The letter that will break her is somewhere on a ship on an Indian Ocean, weeks from reaching her. These two women will never meet, but their grief is joined by the same battle. History tends to skip over both of them. The history moves to Cornwallis, to the coalition, to the march on Seringapatam that came next. And those things matter and we'll get to them. But before we do, all of us owe a moment to what the morning of the 22nd of March 1791 actually looked like for the people of Bangalore. The noise had stopped. That was the first thing. 17 days of sustained bombardment, cannon, musketry, the crack and rumble of siege guns, and then suddenly, nothing. The silence that followed a battle of this scale was not peaceful. It was sepulchral. Into it came other sounds, the groaning of the wounded, the distant crying of children, women. But somewhere in the Pete, a temple bell rings, because life insists on itself even in the worst of circumstances. After the battle, over 1,400 of Tipu's soldiers and civilians had died in the storming of the fort. British casualties across the entire siege numbered about 500, of whom approximately 130 were killed in the taking of the Pete alone. Their bodies lay in the streets, against the walls, in the gateways where the fleeing garrison had been caught in the crush. Bangalore's population at that time was estimated to be around 180,000 people. Many had fled before the siege. Those who had remained had endured 17 days inside a city which was being systematically dismantled by artillery. The morning of 22nd of March was the first morning that they could emerge from their homes. And emerge they did, carefully, quietly, with the particular wariness of people who are not sure if the war is truly over. Families came out to look for their dead. Burial and cremation parties from both sides went to work. And in that work, something quietly remarkable happened. The categories of victor and vanquished briefly dissolved. Soldiers who had spent 17 days trying to kill each other moved among the dead together. Grief was not a language that required translation. Two deaths defined that morning's rituals of mourning, two deaths of importance. On the British side, Colonel Morehouse, killed in the taking of the Pete. He was mourned as one of the most lamented officers of the campaign. Robert Home, an artist, later painted his death on a canvas of considerable power and romanticized pathos. Morehouse was buried with the honors due to his rank. On the Mysore side was Bahadur Khan. He was the Kiledar of Bangalore, 70 years old, commanding 8,000 troops, outnumbered, outgunned, never once wavering though. He had died at his post, fighting, receiving wounds that Roderick Mackenzie, the writer, chronicler, compared as those in number inflicted on Caesar in the Senate. Charles Cornwallis, who respected a soldier when he saw one, offered to return Khan's body to Tipu Sultan. Tipu's reply was that no ground was more honorable for a soldier's burial than the ground on which he had fallen. And so, Bahadur Khan was buried near the Bangalore fort with full military honors. It was attended by senior Muslim officers who had served the British ranks. Everyone showed a mark of respect and solemnity towards a man they had just been fighting. Such was one of the more dignified moments of the entire campaign. And it passed, as such moments tend to, without more ceremony. And then came the opportunists. The hours immediately after the storm were chaotic. The soldiers who had fought their way into the breach were still soldiers, and soldiers who have taken a city by assault don't invariably wait for orders before helping themselves to the contents of the city. This is why there's a phrase for it: pillage, rape, and plunder. The spoils of war. The Pete and the fort saw widespread plundering before Cornwallis could impose the discipline that the situation demanded. This is normal in war. Soldiers go on a spree, the senior brass comes around and set things right. But in the course of all the plundering and the seizing, what the British found was extraordinary. The quantity of gold, jewels, and valuables was so great that one of the chroniclers recorded that penury and want were effectively discharged from the British Army's muster rolls. Many of the wealthier inhabitants had removed all their primary wealth before the British arrived. 17 days had given people enough time to think. But cotton, grain, bales of cloth lay strewn on the streets. Booty was found in concealments and in deserted houses. These hidden caches spoke quietly and unmistakably to the ease and prosperity that the city had known. Cornwallis restored order, and then the looting stopped and the exploration began. Cautious safety guarantees brought the civilians back. Slowly, one by one, merchants, weavers, ordinary residents of the Pete who had fled to the surrounding hills during the battle began to return. The markets reopened quite tentatively. The city reassembled itself in the way cities do after great violence, piece by piece, stall by stall, the ordinary resuming its claim on the extraordinary. And as the British moved through the Pete, they began to understand what they had actually taken. I covered in an earlier episode of this season the Taramandala quarter of Bangalore, the military-industrial complex that Hyder Ali had established in the Pete and that Tipu had expanded and refined. Knowing about all this from the outside and walking through it from the inside turned out to be very different experiences. One chronicler who wrote in 1794, quoting a young officer's first-hand letters, described what the British actually found in Taramandala. A turning machine, lathe if you like, that was powered by a pair of bullocks, and this was capable of boring 50 musket barrels simultaneously. There were engines for boring brass cannon, which appears to have been adapted from designs from a French encyclopedia. There was a mint, there was a foundry. Each Taramandala facility, which the chronicler records, could produce approximately one cannon, 5 or 6 high-quality muskets and 1,000 swords a month, alongside, almost incongruously, with consumer goods, hourglasses, scissors, pocket knives. And the guns that were made in Taramandalapete, one observer noted, was as good as any in the world. And now, half a minute for a commercial break. And when I'm back, let's consider all of what I just said and what it means right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
The British had spent the better part of a decade describing Tipu Sultan as a dangerous man, but also as a primitive adversary, a native despot whose power was borrowed from European advisors and whose state would crumble under proper British pressure. And here inside his city was a weapons manufactory, producing arms of European quality, running on French design machinery, staffed by workers that had been trained by French engineers. Bangalore was not just merely a fortress, it was a factory, it was an arsenal. It was a city that had been methodically built around the industrial logic of modern war. And then there was that other revelation from Taramandalapete, the rocket fabrication facility. Now, I have spoken about Mysore rockets earlier in this season, the iron-cased weapons that had devastated the British infantry at the Battle of Polilur in the Second Anglo-Mysore War, that had so impressed British military thinkers that William Congreve, an engineer, would later study them to develop the British military rocket called the Congreve rocket. It was no more than an improvement of the Mysore rocket. The British were now standing inside the factory where those very rockets had been designed, made, and stored. If you read the contemporary accounts, you would know that that kind of moment invites reflection even from men who are not given to empty reflection. Now, Bangalore had fallen, but what were the British plans? The British, in the weeks following the fall of Bangalore, behaved in every practical sense as though they had intended to stay forever. There was no practical reason to think otherwise. But the war was not over. Tipu had not surrendered. Srirangapatna had not fallen. But Bangalore was firmly in British hands, and Cornwallis moved with characteristic efficiency to make it serve his purpose, a staging ground for the attack on Mysore at Srirangapatna. So at first, the Bengaluru fort was repaired. The walls that the sappers had spent 17 days breaching were now patched and reinforced by the same engineering expertise that had opened them. Bangalore was to be not a trophy, but a base, the most forward and secure position that the British ever held on the Mysore plateau, and Cornwallis intended to use it as such. Colonel Patrick Duff, who had commanded the Bengal artillery during the march to Bangalore, was appointed to garrison the fort. He was left with a substantial force, the 76th Regiment, the 14th Bengal Battalion, the 2nd Battalion of Volunteers, and the 21st Coast Battalion. By such a formidable presence in the Bangalore fort, Cornwallis was leaving real fighting strength in Bangalore because he understood that holding the plateau depended on holding Bangalore city. And then Cornwallis appointed Colonel Alexander Reed as the collector of revenue for Bangalore and the surrounding districts, Hosur, Kolar, Hoskote. What Alexander Reed did was very, very important. He was a political agent to the local Paligars, and these were the hereditary chieftains of the region, as we all know. And so, the appointment of Alexander Reed mattered as much as its administrative title suggested, collector of revenue. But he was also a collector of the Paligars. In earlier episodes, I covered how Tipu Sultan had systematically dismantled the Paligar system across Mysore, stripping the hereditary chiefs of their lands, their revenue rights, their local authority, replacing them with salaried officials accountable directly to the center. What Tipu did was efficient, and what Tipu did was modern. But Not surprisingly, it was resented by every Paligar who had been stripped of what his family had held for generations. Alexander Reed grasped that situation very, very quickly, and he offered Paligars the recovery of their hereditary lands in exchange for forage, cattle, and, of course, intelligence. Contemporary sources reveal that Alexander Reed had bought, by this means, all of the Paligars. Tipu's modernizing revolution, the reform that was supposed to strengthen the state, had produced precisely the conditions for his enemies to exploit. The dispossessed chieftains, the Paligars, with their intimate knowledge of local terrain and their well-organized resentment, became the British Army's intelligence network overnight. Tipu had built a wonderful bureaucratic state, and in doing so, he had eliminated the men with a personal stake in its survival. What came next was Cornwallis's plan to use Bangalore as a staging ground for the attack on Mysore. So the coalition was formed. You might remember the Triple Alliance consisting of the British, the Nizam of Hyderabad, and the Marathas. This coalition was visibly assembling around the repaired Bangalore city. In April 1791, the Nizam of Hyderabad's cavalry arrived at the British camp in Bangalore. Between 10 and 18,000 horse. Now, sources vary on the precise figure, but whatever it was formidable. Their arrival transformed the character of the occupation itself. What had been a British force holding a captured city was now the nucleus of the Triple Alliance. British, Hyderabad and the Marathas with Bangalore as the headquarters, and the war was now no longer between the British and Mysore. It was 3 against 1. When the Maratha forces arrived in Bangalore, they brought a whole mobile bazaar. This bazaar was stocked with cashmere shawls and silver cloth, even Birmingham cutlery. British officers who had been marching and besieging for months found themselves browsing goods from 3 continents within the sight of the walls that they had just taken. It was the surreal commerce of a military encampment, and it sat right alongside the repaired ramparts of the Bangalore fort with a strangeness that nobody apparently found worth remarking. Tipu's summer palace on one end of the fort had drawn the officers in a different way. The palace that had been started by Hyder Ali, completed by Tipu Sultan in 1789, just 2 years before the British walked into it, was decorated with wall hangings of gold and silver cloth. It had tents of fine silk. British and Hyderabadi officers moved through the rooms, built for a man that they were fighting, but admiring what he had made in it. This was the kind of experience that complicates the easy narrative about civilization and conquest, and you can tell this by the officers who recorded their impressions, even if they could not quite articulate exactly what it was. It was enough that they were supremely impressed by what they saw and couldn't hide it. What of Tipu himself? Tipu had watched the fall of Bangalore from a distance, and he was not serene about it. His grief at Bahadur Khan's death, he was said to have wept openly, had started to harden, and Tipu's grief tended to grow into something darker. This always happened with him. In a burst of vengeful fury, he turned on the 19 Highlander prisoners that he had held captive from the earlier war. Men he had already humiliated by making them dress in women's clothing and dance for his court. He had them all killed. It was a pattern that we have seen repeatedly across the season, sudden, exemplary, and directed at those closest at hand. For him, cruelty was a recurring and deliberate instrument, and when the shock of losing Bangalore reached for that instrument of cruelty again. By April 1791, the picture was complete. The fort was repaired and garrisoned. The administration had started running, and the coalition had started to assemble, and it was almost complete. Those Maratha bazaars were open, and the Taramandala factories that had spent years producing weapons of Mysore resistance were now firmly in British hands. Charles Cornwallis stood in the strongest fortress of the kingdom of Mysore and looked where Srirangapatna was, still standing. Tipu, as I said, had not surrendered. The war, as I mentioned, was unfinished. Bangalore had been an objective. Historian Fortescue had written that the fort once taken would make the perfect advanced base from which to reach the final objective of Srirangapatna. Using Bangalore as the first line of defense was something that Chikkadevaraja had ordained when he had commissioned the Bangalore fort. And now, after its fall, it was the staging ground for the attack on Srirangapatna. That moment had arrived. I will cover all that in my next episode, The Road to Seringapatam Part 1, The March Begins, and that's coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is the history of Bangalore.